Hello, Dr. Musgrave. Hope all is well. I think this is the second time that I have been sick while reading my paper. I've had the cold for the past week or so. In any event, as always, my paper is much too long to read within the time frame of 20 minutes. It reads more like 45 minutes instead of 20 minutes. So I'm not going to read everything. I'm going to read some sections, but I do provide a pretty lengthy introduction. I don't typically write about myself personally, but I did somewhat in the introduction. I felt like this was justified because I think often in my writings, I think it comes off across like I'm anti-Bible or anti-God. At least sometimes that's how it feels. And I'm not trying to say that you think that, but I want to be very crystal clear of my views of God in the Bible. I'm very much pro-Bible. I just don't see it quite like you, and that's okay. And so I kind of give some detail of why I approach the scriptures the way I do in my introduction, and that kind of builds towards my topic, dealing with Genesis 1, reflecting a functional, not a material ontology. Okay, so I spend a good deal of showing various authors besides John H. Walton who sees Genesis 1 primarily from a functional view instead of a material origin viewpoint. I include others like N.T. Wright, Tremper Longman. Additionally, I quote Bruggerman as well, Walter Bruggerman. And so then I get to sort of the body of the text. And the question that I had, or I wrote, was how wide is the cultural and religious gap of today's reader and Genesis 1's author or authors? Let me start here. I state this cultural gap cannot be overstated, especially when we read Genesis 1. For example, throughout the semester, we have been discussing Genesis 1 solely from a material origin story. Why? I wonder if anyone really takes the time to ask themselves this question. Why do we, myself included, automatically assume that Genesis 1 is about the material origins of the universe? If we do, I am not sure we think through the question long enough because we are so heavily influenced by our own religious and societal cultures that are primarily based around materialism. I don't mean materialism in the sense of buying or purchasing things, but instead a specific material lens concerned with the material substrate of the cosmos, such things as helium, oxygen, hydrogen, etc. This point isn't meant to disparage ourselves as a society for being interested in what things are made from, but simply to underscore that Christians in the West base their biblical interpretations like Genesis 1 around early and medieval church leaders, namely Augustine of Hippo and John Calvin. Early church theologians or scholars did not have access to the ancient Near East religious records the way we do today. Therefore, it would be wrong to assume Christian writers of the past had a proper understanding of Israelite literature. Longman and Walton state, quote, throughout most of history, scholars have not had access to the information of the ancient world, and therefore could not use it to inform their interpretation. Even the early Christian writers were interested in accessing the ancient world as indicated from their frequent references to Berosus, a Babylonian priest in the 3rd century BC, but had very limited resources. However, since the beginning of the massive archaeological undertaking in Iraq and from the middle of the 19th century, more than 1 million cuneiform texts have been excavated that expose the ancient literature through which we can gain important new insights into the ancient world. That is, what provides the basis for our interpretation of the early chapters of Genesis as an ancient document, end quote. Moreover, I pointed out earlier in the midterm that Calvin's reading of Genesis 1 was a literal description of the universe and was likely influenced by two factors: Calvin's distaste of Augustine's allegorical reading and his dissatisfaction of the Catholic Church's biblical interpretations. Wherefore, we assume that there are only two ways of reading Genesis 1, as either literal or allegorical. Moreover, if there was a bona fide third option, surely our revered religious ancestors like Calvin would have spotted it, right? Wrong. This fatal assumption is, in turn, creates the notion that there cannot be a third way of interpreting Genesis 1. And if there is a third way, most literalist/material types immediately write it off as wrong. I must admit, and I mean this not personally one bit towards Dr. Musgrave's character, but I was shocked to hear Dr. Musgrave say that over the years, he has been introduced from other students, and I'm assuming Mike Harris, regarding John Walton's work about Genesis 1. But has not read the book. That's at least what I heard in our lectures, that Dr. Musgrave has never read John Walton's work. I go back to my original question: why? I understand time and deadlines are a real factor, but I believe there may likely be deeper reasons based around ones that I came up with above. For example, we naturally assume anything dealing with cosmology is based on materialism, and this primarily stems from our Western religious and scientific culture. This example of not willing to even read and engage with what other biblical alternative shows, to me it shows the real danger of bringing our assumptions to the text, and more importantly, our unwillingness to investigate alternatives that likely better align with the ancient Israelites' worldview about cosmology. Personally, I have read bits and pieces of John H. Walton before, but not at the intensity that I should have. I needed to repent for making this error. And I'm grateful that Dr. Musgrave was apprehensive about Walton's premises, because it reignited my own desire to double check on what Walton is trying to say about Genesis 1 reflecting a temple text. Admittedly, Walton's overall theory is very persuasive and makes more sense than a pure material understanding of Genesis 1. For example, Walton states, quote, "In this book, The Lost World of Genesis 1, I propose that people in the ancient world believed that something existed not by virtue of its material properties, but by virtue of its having a function in ordered system. Here I do not refer to an ordered system in scientific terms, but an ordered system in human terms, that is, in relation to society and culture. Hence, it is vital to distinguish between material properties versus functional properties. To best illustrate this, we should ask ourselves the following question: what does it mean for something to exist? In the West, we are so accustomed to assigning existence to anything that is material in its ontology. Ontology means a branch of metaphysics dealing with the nature of being, or a set of concepts or categories in a subject area or domain that show their properties and the relationship between them. Moreover, the ontology, now I'm quoting Walton here, the ontology of X is what means for X to exist. Walton provides two examples of ontological properties: a chair versus a company like a restaurant. A chair is clearly material, and it has material qualities that can be detected with our senses, and given We can detect these physical qualities in a chair. We perceive it to exist. However, when we speak about a company existing, its existence is not defined by the same properties or qualities that we would with a chair. Granted, a company does have physical properties, but that does not fully capture what people mean for a company to exist. This is the case with Genesis 1, dealing with God's creation of the universe. I'm quoting Walton, quote, "Does a company exist when it is filled the appropriate papers of incorporation? Does it exist when it has a building or a website?" In some sense, the answer to these would have to be yes. But many would prefer to speak of a company as existing when it's doing business. Consider what it is communicated when a small retail business frames and displays the first dollar bill from the first sale. As another alternative, consider a restaurant that is required to display its current permit from the City Department of Health. Without that permit, the restaurant could be said not to exist, for it cannot do any business. Here, existence is connected to the authority that governs existence in relation to the function of the business it serves. It is the government permit that causes that restaurant to exist, and its existence is defined in functional terms, end quote. Therefore, the chair's physical properties would be seen as a material ontology, whereas the company would be labeled more as a functional ontology. With these definitions at hand, we can now begin to ask if the Israelites' ontology of the universe were material or primarily functional. Again, I would argue it reads more functional than material, and the text bears this out. Granted, the person reading the text may say, quote, "Of course it's dealing with the material ontology. If not, why would the text be talking about the creation of a sun or the moon and stars?" Just because something is made of a material sort doesn't mean there could be a functional category that is also assigned to the material object, like I expressed earlier with the restaurant analogy. Moreover, no one is denying, including Walton, that the Israelites couldn't look up and perceive material objects like a sun or a moon and stars, but their concern was not a scientific material ontology. Quote, this is Walton, "In the ancient world, they were not ignorant of the senses and the level at which objects could be perceived by the senses. They would have no difficulty understanding the physical nature of objects. The question here concerns not what they perceived, but what they gave significance to." I would agree with Walton. They could perceive the sun, moon, and stars with their senses, but not to the degree that our scientific tools possess in accurately detailing the physical elements involved with the sun, moon, and stars. In other words, if the Israelites did try to articulate a scientific ontology, they wouldn't have had the ability to accurately describe Genesis 1 as a material description of the universe. In fact, even if we took their model of the universe as materialistic, it resembles a material universe nothing like our own today. Walton states that Genesis 1, quote, "does not attempt to describe cosmology in modern terms or address modern questions. The Israelites received no revelation to update or modify their scientific understanding of the cosmos. They did not know that the stars were suns. They did not know that the earth was spherical and moving through space. They did not know that the sun was much further away than the moon, or even further than the birds flying in the air. They believed that the sky was material, not vaporous, solid enough to support the residence of deity, as well as to hold back waters. In these ways, and in many others, they thought about the cosmos in much the same way that anyone in the ancient world thought, and not at all like anyone thinks today," end quote. Furthermore, if Genesis 1 doesn't reflect the current scientific consensus of today, there isn't any guarantees that today's cosmology can't change in the future and thereby frustrate people's belief in the biblical text as well. Quote, "We are well aware that the science is dynamic rather than static, but its very nature, science is in a constant state of flux. If we were to say that God's revelation corresponds to, quote, true science, we adopt the idea contrary to the very nature of science. What is accepted as true today may not be accepted as true tomorrow because what science provides is the best explanation of the data at the time," end quote. And that again is from Walton. Ironically, this point not only holds for liberal materialists, but equally true with so-called biblical literalists or fideists, namely the idea that one's justification in the Bible is based on sheer faith despite prevailing secular evidence. For example, a person attempting to justify God creating the world in 6 days tends to hold a scientific posture because they think that the creation text in Genesis 1 is material in nature, and therefore unknowingly justify their faith in Genesis 1 in an alternative material science. At its most extreme level, they will support pseudo-scientific arguments like the only reason that the geological age of the earth appears to be billions of years old is because God is testing one's faith to see if they will believe that the earth was created in 6 days based on Genesis 1. While I find this line of thinking courageous, it nevertheless is dangerous because it's putting one's genuine faith into something that is not required based on reading the text at face value. The original point I am attempting to point out here is just because a text is describing material properties like the sun, moon, and stars, it doesn't mean it was meant to be read as materialistic in its origin, but instead as a functional governance of God's rule in aiding mankind. I can still imagine how a materialist/literalist type will wonder, quote, "How can a person be sure the Israelites meant the cosmos to be a functional orientation and not merely a material property?" My answer is by deduction, using historical and exegetical clues, and I will only focus on the exegetical clues for this paper. So I'm at 17 minutes, and let's see how far I can get in 3 minutes. So the next question is, biblical accounts that confirm that creation or bara typically is seen from a fictional viewpoint. So let's take the word bara that's found in Genesis 1, meaning creation. Okay, so to prove this proposition, Walton looks to the word bara, to create, a verb in Hebrew. Walton asks, what does this word mean? At face value, this almost sounds like a wasted question. Don't we already know what it means? It must mean material activity. However, this material definition reflects a more English definition and not a biblical definition. For example, in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, it states that creation means, quote, a verb, to make, to bring into existence something new, an artist who is good at imitating but not at creating, end quote. Unsurprising, Walton states that readers of the biblical text must begin wrapping our minds around the Hebrew verb create, which doesn't necessarily reflect the English usage. Instead, a reader should ask how ancient Israelites would have understood the term. Okay, I'm going to skip. According to Walton, the ancients viewed existence as functional activity and not material activity. Namely, we must look at the meaning of words. And let's see, I got about a minute left. I'm going to skip down right here. Walton provides 47 grammatical objects in connection with the verb bara. Quote, the grammatical following categories, objects of the verb can be cosmos, people in general, specific groups of people, specific individuals of types of individuals, creatures, phenomena, darkness, components of the cosmic geography, condition. According to Walton, this list shows that grammatical objects of the verb are not easily identified in material terms. And even when they are, it is questionable that the context is objectifying them. That is, no clear example occurs that demands a material perspective for the verb, though many are ambiguous. I'm going to end here, but I'm going to end, there's so much more to this paper, but I'll just end with this conclusion. I submit on day 8, from there on, God has entrusted us with his stewardship like he did the ancient king of Israel, to act in his image by managing the affairs of God, namely to elevate mankind to become like him. Another way of putting it, acting in God's image also means to be wise stewards of the earth that serves as a primary function to enable man to fulfill his or her full potential. That means not just damaging our habitat and ourselves with technological annihilation, but rather making the planet like Eden. Wherefore Genesis, in my estimation, belongs as a temple text, which I didn't get to. This is solely focused on describing the functional universe to serve as an inauguration of God on his throne. Furthermore, the temple served as a microcosm of God's functional universe, underscored by key clues, specifically Hebrew words such as created, beginning, and rest. They each appear to be describing something else. Sorry, that's my daughter screaming for me. She's only a year. Other than mere materialism, but rather a functional ontology that served as part of the backdrop of the Israelites' temple, dealing with the inauguration of both Yahweh and his vice-regent, the Israelite king. I have more here, but I'm going to end here. I think you get a general sense of where I'm going here. I take a deep look at some of the words that feel as if they are material, but they really are not. And I try to give my best explanation as to why. Thanks, Dr. Musgrave. See you.